My favorite author is Jack London. His style of writing just paints a very vivid picture in my mind. As I read his stories, it feels like I'm right there in the middle of it. And one of his most well-known works is titled To Build a Fire. This is the opening paragraph of that story. Day had dawned cold and gray when the man turned aside from the main Yukon Trail. He climbed the high earth bank where a little-traveled trail led east through the pine forest. It was a high bank, and he paused to breathe at the top. He excused the act to himself by looking at his watch. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. There was no sun or promise of sun, although there was not a cloud in the sky. It was a clear day. However, there seemed to be an indescribable darkness over the face of things. That was because the sun was absent from the sky. This fact did not worry the man. He was not alarmed by the lack of sun. It had been days since he had seen the sun. There's something about the quiet, dark, biting cold of northern Canada that really fascinates me. I've lived in cold climates, but nothing like that. When the outside temperature gets to be way below zero, the constant thought is just what you have to do in order to survive. My guest today is David. He and his partner in this adventure, Scott, dreamed of spending time in those conditions. But what they encountered just in the first few days had them, from 1 hour to the next, wondering what else could go wrong. Real people in unreal situations.
The eerie silence when I walked in, and he's just staring at me.
I was like, hello, like, are you okay? And then I had to tell him it was me.
There was just blood everywhere.
They're shouting, they're screaming, they're being hit by bullets, they're hitting the ground.
And in that moment, I literally thought, this is how I die.
Everything changed then.
And I just thought to myself, this isn't happening.
Every single story deserves to be heard.
I'm Scott Johnson, and this is What Was That Like? This whole story just really fascinates me. When did this type of adventure first become a dream of yours?
Well, when I was very young, growing up here in Northwest Indiana, my mom and dad made the decision to get rid of the family TV. So for about 13 years, I grew up without a television. And
what kind of child abuse is that?
I know, right? Right. Exactly. My friends, it was such a novelty. They just thought I was crazy. And I, of course, was frustrated with this at first. I was too little to really kind of understand, but I began to realize, I began to do other things. And one of those things was just going into the woods. And I spent all of my time in the outdoors, doing what kids do, building forts, climbing trees, etc. And there were two things that happened probably around the time I was 12 or 13 that really changed how I viewed my relationship with this wild place. One of them was reading a book called My Side of the Mountain. And it's funny, the more I listen to podcasts about stories like this, the more I find that's a common theme. But it's a story about a kid who runs away and lives in the Catskill Mountains. And I wanted to be this character. It just fascinated me. And the other thing was I found an arrowhead in a field kind of next to this woods. And the idea that the last person that touched this probably, most likely, was a Native American. And here I am picking this thing up, and it just had a profound impact on me. I began reading everything I could find on how these people lived, what skills they used to kind of stay alive. And also, discovering they had a really, I guess, a deeper kind of spiritual connection to the wild. And it was around this time that I really started to dream about putting these skills to the test and experiencing this type of lifestyle. And I dreamt about it so much that I actually wrote a story when I was in middle school about running away and living in a log cabin in the middle of Canada. And it's just kind of odd that transpired the way it did. That's kind of where this whole thing began.
Who would have thought that just getting rid of the family TV would be such for you, a literally life-changing experience?
Yeah, I'm going to attribute it to that. Now, who's to say? But I think there's a pretty good chance. I wasn't sitting there in front of that just kind of zoning out. So
we need to do a little bit of setup on this trip.
Sure.
Okay. The origin of the trip. Tell us who Doc Forgy is and his cabin.
Sure. In Dr. Forgy, or Doc as everyone loves to call him, he is a physician here in the area, but he's also an entrepreneur of the highest order. And he began he was obviously very interested in the outdoors, and he paired that interest with his love of practicing medicine. So he began writing books on wilderness medicine, on hypothermia, on how to care for people in very remote places, which really at the time, back in the early 70s, there wasn't a lot written about this. Now it's a very common, there's all kinds of courses and things like that. One of the things that he ended up deciding to do after taking a couple of trips into northern Canada was to build his own log cabin. And he began doing that in the early 70s, again, 1974. This cabin is about 120 miles from the nearest town, which is Churchill, Manitoba. To get there, just to give you an idea of distance, we drove 15 hours to Winnipeg. Then we took a train for about 23 hours to Thompson. And then you fly a bush plane for about an hour and a half or an hour and 30 minutes to get to this location. So you're way out in the middle of nowhere.
Remote is a big understatement.
Definitely.
How did you meet with Doc and figure out, okay, let's go to this cabin?
Sure. Great question. Well, I mentioned Doc was an entrepreneur, and he, at the same time, he founded and started a camping store called Indiana Camp Supply. And one of the things that was interesting about this camping store was they were really renowned for their medical kits and things like that. Prior to going to the cabin, this was 1989-ish, I went into this camping store. I was getting ready to work for the SCA, the Student Conservation Association out in Wyoming. And I went in there to buy some gear. And the guy behind the counter was Scott Power, who was working there temporarily. He began telling me about a trip he was planning for, which was to fly. He was heading to this cabin. They had a big trip planned in 1989 to go up there with the Wilderness Education Association. So he was telling me about his trip. I was telling him about mine. And that was that. Well, when I came home, I ended up getting a job at this camping store. And Doc came strolling in, and he wasn't running it at the time. When he walked in, the owner of the store said, "Yeah, that's Doc. That's the guy who built the cabin." And I walked up to him and I extended my hand, and I didn't even say my name. I said, "I have to go to this place." And he said, "Well, we'll see what we can do to get you up there." Really, that's kind of how this whole story began.
And your partner in this adventure was Scott, the guy that was working at the store.
Indeed. Yeah. He, the interesting thing about Scott was that trip that he took in 1989 was the very first time he ever spent in a tent. It was his very first camping experience. And while he was there, he told Doc, he said, I want to come back here and stay for a year. And some of that, I'm sure there was a bit of naivety in that, reflex without really knowing what he was getting into. However, when he when we were both up there, he really took to the task and ended up coming out of that experience really an expert outdoorsman. And I'm always fascinated and amazed that somebody could do that. I had been kind of gearing myself up for this my whole life, and this was a new experience for him, but that's his personality. He's very much all in, extrovert, let's go, let's do it. And so it was a very good meeting, a very good matchup. Yeah.
It seems like you almost have to have a personality like that. Like, yeah, let's do it. We can do this, but you also have to balance it with, wow, this is life-threatening conditions at times. So you've got to have a balance of that, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So you're planning to go to this cabin. Did you think about bringing some kind of radio or some kind of communication just in case of an emergency?
Well, it's a great question. There was a lot of debate about that. We did not. And the reason we didn't was because it's almost, in some sense, even if you have a radio, your odds up there of being able to connect with someone, with some plane flying over, because the radios at the time really didn't have the reach to just like a satellite phone or anything like that. And maybe those existed at the time. I'm sure they did, but we couldn't afford something like that. But having something like that, I think our feeling was it would be a bit like having an unloaded gun, whereas maybe you think, oh, I'm safe because I have this, and therefore I can push things a little bit, or I can, because I've got this to fall back on. And really, the odds of being able to connect with someone, and even if you connect with them, the odds of them being able to send in a flight to get you out, I mean, that's hit or miss. It just depends on the conditions, the time of year. For example, if you were to do that during the spring thaw, you'd probably be in big trouble because there's just no place a plane can land.
Yeah, I can see that would be, you really have to be in the mindset that, yep, we are completely on our own. We have to just get it right the first time. I know you brought some supplies with you, but if you only ate the food that you brought, how long would that have lasted?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that we scheduled 3 different kind of resupplies. So Dr. Forgy was going to be flying in every quarter to just bring us more food and the supplies. Really, we brought an excess of the staples, I guess, if you will. So flour, salt, sugar, all the basics. And then on top of that, a lot of freeze-dried food, some canned food, non-perishables, and things of that nature, but mostly a pretty starchy diet. So supplementing that with additional protein that we could either fish or hunt was going to be a big part of this.
The journey to get to the cabin to start with, first it was a drive to Winnipeg, but what was each segment? How are you going to get there?
It was I think it was a 15-hour drive from Chicago to Winnipeg. And the next day it was a train ride that was about a little over 23 hours, I think, to get to Thompson. And then from there, it was a flight. Now, keep in mind, we're starting this adventure in January. And one of the primary reasons for doing that was because when we fly in, we're landing on a lake that's about 3 miles from the cabin. Really, up to that point, it was the only place that bush pilots would land comfortably. So we've got a 3-mile muskeg crossing, and we've got 2,000 pounds or 1,800 pounds of gear. So being able to pull that across with sleds was going to be substantially easier. The muskeg up there, if you can imagine it, is almost like if you're walking on it in the summer, it's like walking on a waterbed. So it's very difficult. So having the sleds was going to make that significantly easier.
Okay, so you land on the lake and you're 3 miles away. You unloaded everything. Actually, I remember you said you couldn't, and I know this because I've read your book, and we'll talk about the book in a minute, but you couldn't fly until the temperature warmed up to minus 40 degrees.
Yeah, it was right around that range, minus 40, minus 30, something like that. In fact, when we arrived at the airport there, the crew was around this bush plane. It was a single engine de Havilland Otter, and they had a portable, like a John Deere heater that they were aiming at the hydraulics of the skis that were attached to the. So that gives you an idea. Like, yeah, it's pretty cold up here.
So it warmed up a little bit, and you, as you're flying, you kind of flew over to where the cabin was, right? Did you see it from the plane?
Absolutely. Yeah. We wanted to make sure that things looked, A, that it was there, period, and B, that it at least appeared structurally sound. There was no big holes in the roof or anything like that. So we did several low passes over the cabin before flying then onto our what we call landing lake, which is an appropriate name. So we definitely checked it out from the air to make sure everything was at least in as good a shape as it could be.
And this is January, dead of winter. Of course, everything is covered with snow, right?
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. So, you can only tell so much from the air, but you could definitely tell if there was some caved in, if the roof was caved in or something like that, and everything appeared sound. So at least as far as we could tell from the air. So we were good to go. We finally took off. We took off a little later than we had originally planned, just because it was so terribly cold. I want to say that we landed there probably around 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. And another thing to keep in mind is we're so far north that you're experiencing, I would say, a good 17 or 18 hours of darkness in the winter. And we knew this going in. In fact, we kind of planned this date at a time when we knew there was going to be a full moon. So we'd kind of taken that into account as well. So we were kind of expecting that we were going to be, by the time we reached the cabin, it was probably going to be dark anyway.
You land and you had to unload pretty quickly because the pilot was concerned about the plane's engine freezing if they stayed too long.
Yeah, he gave us about 10 minutes to get our gear out because he did shut the engine off, and we hastily threw all of our gear out. And the fact that we had kind of a time limit was probably a good thing because it didn't really give you time to think. It was like, just get everything out and let's move on. And before I knew it, we're standing there surrounded by all this gear. The pilot is in his seat in the plane with his door open, and he stared at us for quite a while. I think almost because he knew, he lives up there. He knows what this environment is like. And he gave us a good look. And I think just to make sure, these crazy Americans, are you, these kids, are you sure you want to do this? And we waved goodbye. He shut the door and he taxied and took off. And this moment, for me anyway, was really a profound moment of this whole experience. Watching that plane fly away, we stood and watched that plane until it disappeared. And we listened to the engine until we couldn't hear it anymore. And the whole time we're getting cold. And when you could no longer hear the engine of that plane, the silence was really something I'd never experienced. We're so accustomed to noise. And the silence of the winter up there it's almost annoying. You almost have to get used to it in a way. I like to say the silence was deafening. It's just a weird thing that you can't get used to.
The way you phrased it in the book, you said, quite suddenly, there was only the vast, great, white quiet of the North.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great way to put it. How quickly did you start to feel the effects of that extreme cold? And what was the temperature right then? Do you remember?
We believe that it was probably around 35 below, somewhere in that neck of the woods. And really, when if you creep past 20 below, it's just cold, period. It's, it doesn't matter if it's 20 below or 50 below. Yes, they're both, you can certainly encounter extreme differences, but cold is cold. And not knowing what those temperatures were like, both of us had pretty much every scrap of winter gear on that we had. And it's funny looking at those pictures because, we had like full balaclavas and the whole 9-yard face masks and everything. And of course, after about 20 steps into the trees, we're starting to peel layers back because you're exerting so much work that it definitely is a contrast to the cold.
And we're going to have pictures of this in the episode notes so people can see this. What you had ahead of you now was what you looked at as a short 3-hour hike in snowshoes to get to the cabin, right? Can you just take us through what happened?
Sure. Yeah. So our next task is really to break this snowshoe trail from the lake to the cabin. The only way to do this, because the terrain is so dense with these spruce trees, is using a compass. We knew the correct azimuth from the lake to the cabin. All we had to do was ensure that we were staying on course, break this snowshoe trail, and by nightfall, we would be enjoying a nice dinner and some hot chocolate. It took about, 10 steps into the tree line. At first, I thought maybe the snow is just really drifted right at the edge of this lake. But it turned out like the snow was incredibly deep to start, and snow in those conditions is like powdered sugar. It doesn't pack necessarily. So we pretty quickly realized, these snowshoes that we had, they were more modern with the aluminum frame and much narrower than, say, a traditional snowshoe. And we were essentially kind of punching into the snow. So you're almost doing twice as much work. And we realized pretty quickly this was not going to be a short 3-hour hike.
I'm picturing, as you take each step, the snow that's around your shoe falls on top of the shoe. So as you lift that foot, you're picking up that extra snow as well each time. It's like doing double the work.
Exactly. It did help a bit, but it also, for the reasons you mentioned, it just added more work. And keep in mind too, that morning when we were getting ready to go, we sat down for breakfast. You can't really eat a full breakfast because your nerves are just, they're firing off. We did have water, of course, and we did our best to insulate that from the cold. But, probably halfway through this hike, we realized that water had frozen. And so we'd had very little to eat. We'd had very little to drink, and we're outputting a tremendous amount of energy. So things are getting a little intense.
You had mentioned the word muskeg.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure how many people realize what that actually is. Frozen muskeg. It's kind of like waterlogged vegetation, sort of.
Exactly. Yeah. It is a little hard to describe, but yeah, just vast amounts of kind of moss covered earth that essentially is growing on top of. It's referred to as a swamp. It's a muskeg swamp. So walking on that is really quite challenging. We were making progress. It was more difficult than we anticipated. The entire time, after a while, we just start looking for the river because the river is in a very shallow valley, and you can see it once you kind of reach a certain point. And so we've now been hiking for 4 hours. So we're an hour over our estimated time. And all of a sudden I hear Scott say, "Oh my, there it is. There's the river." Sure enough, you could see this kind of a silver vein down in the valley. And it was at this point I remember Doc had mentioned to me, he's like, "Well, when you can see the river, you're about halfway there."
Oh, what a...
Yeah. It felt very much like when Lewis and Clark first peeked over the Rockies, thinking that they were just going to see the Pacific Ocean on the other side, and it was just nothing but more mountains. That was this. It was a bit of a blow, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is getting difficult.
Yeah, when you planned on a 3-hour hike, and now you've been going 4 hours, and now you just suddenly realize you're maybe halfway there.
Exactly. Yeah. And now it's already getting dark, and we still have another 4 hours left to go.
Now, you had a full moon, so that was in your favor. Did you have flashlights also, or headlamps?
No. No. I don't even know if those were maybe those were a thing back in the early 90s. I can't recall, but no, we didn't. We most of the lighting, I guess, that we had was going to be for inside of the cabin, like Coleman lanterns and things like that.
So after 3 more hours, now you're on the riverbank.
Yep.
Okay.
We land on the riverbank. We do have a map, of course, of the area, pretty detailed map. The riverbank that we landed on was this big sweeping bend in the river. And of course, the cabin itself is located on a big sweeping bend of the river. I'd never been there. Scott had been there 2 years or a few years earlier. So as far as we were concerned, like, okay, this is the place. So we just started we're like, the cabin can't be that far. So we just started looking. We're kind of weaving in and out of the trees, and an hour goes by and we have no cabin. And then another hour goes by, and now things are getting grim. A, we don't have the cabin. B, we're exhausted from this ridiculous hike. Very little to eat, very little to drink, and the temperatures are dropping still. We continued to search for that 2 hour time period. So we've hiked 8 hours. We've been searching now for 2. And suddenly we realize, like, we need to do something. It's that moment when you hear these stories, and when someone says, it was at that moment that I realized, like, we're in trouble. The only real option that we had, we didn't bring a tent across with us because we were headed for a cabin. So why would we do that? Most of the food that we brought required extra cooking and things like that. So the decision was made at that moment to build some type of shelter. A snow shelter was out of the option just because it takes way too long to pack. So we built a simple kind of A-frame lean-to type of shelter with a ridge pole resting up against a tree, and then spruce boughs kind of forming the roof of this structure. We're trying to do this, again, with like zero energy. We're feeling like the early stages of hypothermia are starting to kind of set in because we're no longer putting out all of that energy. And so we build this thing. And frankly, the shelter itself, I don't think could have protected anyone or anything. It was really quite miserable. But I do think the action that we took to build that shelter was beneficial in that we were taking some action. We were moving, we were doing something. So once we had this poorly constructed shelter up, we laid a bunch of pine boughs on the floor of this. We opened up one of our sleeping bags flat, and then we each climbed into the other sleeping bag. So it's 2 of us stuffed into this one sleeping bag, and we pulled the open one around us, and we just hugged each other to kind of share what little heat we had. And this is suddenly you realize, like, this is really serious. I mean, this is a serious situation.
Not exactly how you planned the first night sleeping that night.
No, I didn't want to be laying there spooning my partner I was like, that was not part of the equation at all.
And how old were you guys right then?
I was 19 and Scott was 20. So we're, kids essentially.
Yeah, I can picture people hearing this. They must be thinking, these are kids who have no idea what they're doing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I get a lot of that from time to time, and to be fair, and not to be not to toot my own horn, so to speak, but like, I definitely was prepared for this. I wasn't experienced in that exact environment, but like, I'd gone through a couple of like Tom Brown survival schools. I'd again, spent all of my time in the outdoors. So I had a really solid skill set. I was comfortable with what I knew. The funny thing is, I think the outdoors, Mother Nature in general, always has a way, you could be the most skilled, you could have the best gear, but Mother Nature is Mother Nature. And, the slightest mistake or something you'll pay for it. And that's what we were doing at that moment in time.
Yeah, there's no forgiveness out there. So you guys got settled into this sleeping bag together. Was there a conversation? Were you guys nervous? Like, I hope we survive the night?
Our conversation consisted of about every half hour, one would ask the other, "Are you okay?" And then he'd say, yeah, I'm okay. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm okay." And I kept complaining about my feet. My toes felt like they were on fire. And so I'd taken off my boots and I began kind of wringing my toes in my hands, like as best I could inside this bag, just to try to kind of keep them flexible, keep the blood flow moving. I asked Scott, I'm like, "Are your feet bothering you?" He said, "No, not at all." And that's how the night went. I think another thing that was interesting to me was that it was incredibly beautiful, this landscape. It's just in the moonlight, it was stunning. But it was also silent, as I mentioned. And so occasionally you could hear trees popping in the distance from that extreme cold. I guess the sap expands and this can happen. And the other sound that I remember was the sound of my breath when I exhaled. You could hear it freeze, like when it hit the air. Like it sounded like when you spray a Windex bottle, it hissed. Every time you exhale, it was this little hiss of noise, and it's just your breath, crystallizing essentially in that air. So it was just surreal. It was very, very bizarre.
Can you describe, first of all, did you sleep at all during the night? And then just describe when you woke up. Was there relief that you had at least survived that night?
I think there were pockets of sleep, obviously not very sound sleep, but there were pockets of sleep. And, both of us just like a kid the night before Christmas, just you can't wait to get up, just waiting for the sun. And when the sun finally started to peek over the horizon, it was a big motivator. And we were also elated by the fact that okay, all right, we're okay. And all we got to do is regroup and let's figure this out and we'll be fine. That morning, I had a horrible time trying to get my boots back on. I had mucklucks, which are very, much more flexible, almost like moccasins, but they're, obviously more insulated, and they were just frozen solid. And so trying to cram my foot in there it took a long time. We decided, once we kind of got up, we decided to look again for the cabin in daylight. We searched for about an hour that morning and realized we're not finding it. So we need to go back to the lake to where all of our gear and supplies are and just regroup. And luckily, because we'd broken that snowshoe trail the day before, our trip back took about half as long as our trip in. It's because we'd beat this trail down really good. And once we got back to the lake, we ended up setting up, it's called an expedition tent. It's a canvas Eureka style tent that has a kerosene stove and, the whole 9 yards. The problem was the elbow for this stovepipe we knew was at the cabin, or we'd been told was at the cabin. But here again, why would we be using this tent and this stove prior to using the cabin itself? So we did the best thing we could. We fashioned something out of, I think, aluminum foil. We did what we had to do. And that was resourcefulness, I think, was a huge lesson throughout this whole experience, because whatever you bring in, that's what you got. And if you don't have it, you don't have it. And so we kind of rigged this thing up, and we got the tent set up. We got inside. We started this stove,
and this is heated or fueled by kerosene.
Yep. A little tiny drip kerosene stove. All of a sudden, you could just start to feel kind of the fingers of warmth kind of creeping in a little bit, and that was exciting. So now we fill up a pot full of snow and put it on the stove. And right about the time that snow was turning into slush, the only liquid form of water for 120 miles, I heard Scott yell fire. And looking up, that section of the stovepipe that we rigged ended up catching the top part of our tent on fire. And here again, I mean, this is where you're like, oh my God, these guys have no idea what they're doing. And we were kind of victims of circumstance at that point. I put my kind of heavy mitts on and essentially slapped this stove out of the tent. Scott used something and kind of to put there was a little bit of flame on the door of the tent. So he got that taken care of. And in those brief few seconds, that slushy water, the melting snow, that was frozen solid. So once again, we've got nothing to drink. I think the only thing keeping us warm at this point is just anger. We're just pissed off. We've done all this work. We planned 2 years in advance for this trip, and really we put in the work, and things are just unraveling like at breakneck speed. And so we're angry, and we kind of hunker down in our bags. We're at least somewhat protected in this tent. However, that night, a pretty bad storm whipped up, and we're exposed. We set this thing up right where we dropped it. So we're essentially on the lake, and we're getting battered by wind, and it essentially kind of knocked this tent partially down. I mean, it was awful, and we didn't even care. We were just like, we're exhausted, and we just kind of suffered through that.
Yeah. So now you have night number 2 outside. I mean, I just can imagine you're thinking, what else could happen?
Well, yeah. And, I think we probably knew well enough not to say it can't get any worse than this. But I think we were both thinking that, and maybe hoping this is as bad as it's going to be. Yeah.
I can only think as a podcaster, if I'm going through something like this, I would already be thinking, man, all we have to do is get through this, and I'm going to have such a great story to tell people.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Well, I think the other thing too, the other important factor was, when you're 19 or 20 years old, you're certainly a bit naive, and you're also kind of invincible, if I were to find myself in that situation now, I'd probably just die there on the side of the lake, because it's like, in part because you also have a lot more information where, like, you realize the odds of kind of making it through something like this. You have a lot more data stuffed in your head. When you're 19, you're just like, it's really cold and I'm uncomfortable, but yeah, whatever, like I can, and I'm making it sound trivial, which we weren't treating it like that. Clearly this was a serious situation, and we were well aware of that fact.
So you spent another night, you woke up, and so it's time to search for the cabin again.
Exactly. Yeah. So this time, knowing kind of what we ran into that first night, we loaded the sleds, and we packed a much more modern tent, if you will, kind of a geodesic dome style tent. We also packed a 1-burner like backpacking stove and some white gas and more food, and off we went back to the river. And by the time we reached the river, we didn't even bother searching that night. We were very cold. We were very exhausted, obviously hungry and dehydrated. So the goal was just, let's set the tent up and let's try to get some warmth and fuel in us. But herein, of course, lies another problem. those tents. I don't know if you've ever set up one of those dome style tents, but they have these kind of flexible fiberglass poles that can collapse down. So there's like, each pole is like 8 individual sections of 8 lengths that are held together with a like a shock cord that runs in between them. People that go camping will be very familiar with this. And the problem is at 40 below or whatever, when you stretch that shock cord, the elasticity just disappears. So it just droops back. It doesn't want to pull itself back. So now we have to cut each one of these pieces of shock cord out from each one of these sections of poles. And to do that, you have to you can't wear heavy mitts and handle a pocket knife, obviously. So you take your gloves off, you cut both ends of the shock cord, and then you move on to the next section. There's 50 of these cuts that we have to make. And so you get maybe 3 of them cut out, and then you've got to put your mitts back on because your hands just don't function when it's that cold. They just do not work.
Right. You had no stove right now for any source of heat.
Exactly. So finally, we get all of these things cut out. And by now, once we had the tent set up, I can remember watching as Scott was climbing into the tent, and I asked him some question. He turned and looked at me, and his appearance really struck me in that he appeared really gaunt, almost bluish. Clearly, he did not look good at all. And then I thought, well, I must look exactly the same. This is bad. So we dive into this tent, and we close the door. We load some white gas into our 1-burner stove. And even that, at those temperatures, you've got to be really careful because that fuel is essentially supercooled. So, spilling that on your hand or on exposed skin could really be, you could really do some damage there. So we finally get this stove fired up. The second that thing was lit, the inside of this tent, it almost like inflated, with all of that hot air. And I mean, it was instantly warm.
That must have been luxurious.
It was the greatest feeling in the world. I mean, just so all of a sudden we could start removing some of this heavy gear and start melting snow for water and preparing some food. And yeah, that evening was almost a celebration because we realized hey, we have a system here, and it's not pretty, but it works. So long as our fuel holds out, we should be in good shape. So we were pretty excited. And, I remember climbing into my sleeping bag that night. This is kind of an interesting, funny side story. And I think both of us were wearing hats and probably gloves, and, we were buried in these bags. And I awakened in the middle of the night, and I had to go to the bathroom. And, normally you'd have if you're just going number one, you'd have some kind of a container handy so that you're not having to go. Well, we didn't really have that. So I get up and I've really got to go.
So that means you had to leave the warmth of the tent.
Leave the warmth of my bag. And, the tent at that point was just as cold as it was outside. I mean, the second that stove goes out, it's instantly cold. But we're pretty warm in our bags, and we had food and water, and I had to go really bad. So first I have to psych myself up. I have to, to jump out of my bag, and it's I don't want to do this at all. So I jump out of my bag, I grab the zipper of the tent to open the door, and I realize that the zipper is welded shut with a bead of ice from our breath, from all of the condensation from our breath. Absolutely welded shut with ice. I'm desperately trying to pull on this zipper, and it's just not going anywhere. And meanwhile, I'm getting colder and colder. Finally, I end up breaking this free and getting to take care of business. But almost got hypothermia just trying to go to the bathroom that night. So it was pretty bad.
You okay? So you figured out how to pee. You know the next question that's coming.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. Well, at that point we hadn't had we hadn't really had to go.
You hadn't eaten
Number
anything
two.
much, right?
Yeah, we hadn't eaten anything. I now this next day that I'm about to dive into was my first foray, my first experience with taking a dump at 40 below. So yeah, that comes with all of its own little challenges.
What are the challenges of that? I mean, what do you have to consider?
Well, I think just speed, essentially. Like it's not, you're not reading a magazine or like looking at your iPhone while you want that business done as quickly as possible. And frankly, it's uncomfortable, but not terrible. I mean, it's one of those things that the thought of it just sounds miserable, but yet it's another one of those things that when you get into that environment, it's like you just kind of acclimatize and it becomes everyday life,
You do what you got to do.
Yep. You do what you got to do.
Okay. So you made it through that night, and I understand you slept a little bit later that morning.
Yeah. The exhaustion, the stress, the frustration, all of those things, I think, just kind of bubbled up to the surface, and we were wiped out. And, we're in this comfortable, warm place. So it's like, we're going to take advantage of this, at least briefly, because this is really the first time we'd found any level of comfort. As I mentioned before, I was complaining about my feet when we were in that bivouac shelter that we built. And he said he had no issues. Now, Scott didn't take his mucklucks off. And if you can imagine, I mean, he'd just done all of this work, exported all of these calories, and was, his feet are sweating in these mucklucks, and he left them on in the sleeping bag. And so when we awakened this morning, he called my name. I was shuffling through some gear or something, and I turned around. He was holding his leg up, and his entire foot was just a deep blue color. And we both clearly realized that he had suffered some pretty bad frostbite on that foot. And luckily it wasn't severe enough. It was at such a state that it could be saved. The extremity could be saved so long as no further damage was done to it. If he freezes that any further, he's going to lose that foot. So now we have a 2-man team that's now cut down to a 1-man team.
I wanted to hear from Scott on what went through his mind when he realized he had frostbite. Here's Scott.
When I first saw the frostbite on my right foot, I have to admit that it was very kind of surreal, odd moment, because for the first time in my life, I didn't recognize my own right foot. It did not look the same. My left foot was fine, but my right foot, the toes, my big toe, my heel, they were black and blue and purple and swollen and clearly frostbitten. And in that moment, it was a very surreal, confusing moment. It was not what I was expecting to see because I was unaware of any pain or discomfort in my right foot up until that time. And so seeing it was very much a kind of a shock and very unexpected. And so, once I came to grips with what was going on, I was quite frankly angry with myself, angry that I had put not just my life, but David's life in jeopardy as well, because suddenly a 2-man team is cut down to 1 man. And because I can't leave the tent, I can't, go outside at 50 below zero because I have frostbite and don't want to risk refreezing. And so I was angry at myself. I was for being so reckless and irresponsible, angry at myself for jeopardizing the trip, but grateful because I had this amazing partner, David Scott, to go get the first aid kit and help me deal with this thing, and grateful that Dr. Forgy, our kind of patron and underwriter of the trip, the owner of ICS Books at the time, had trained us so well. Dr. Forgy is known as the father of wilderness medicine, and he had trained us so well. And so we were prepared for these kinds of things. But, you sort of, when you're 20 years old, you think you're invincible. And then when you realize you're not invincible, it's a real shock to the system. And so I think that, finally you get to that point of acceptance where you just say, okay, well, I just got to deal with this. And the only way forward is forward. And so you just, you don't panic. You breathe, you think through, you rely on your training, and you do what you can do and hope for the best. And so it was definitely one of those moments where I realized that I was vulnerable and reckless, and I was just angry with myself, I think, more than anything.
Scott has no choice really but to stay in the tent. So this obviously changed our plans for the day. And instead of searching for the cabin, I told Scott, I said, well, I'm going to go back to the lake. I'm going to get the medical kit. I'm going to get extra food, and I'll bring that back. And once again, we can try to regroup and figure out what our next steps are going to be. I know if I were Scott, the thought of being trapped, having to stay in a tent, or would definitely be disheartening. And I know it frustrated him. He wanted to clearly help and participate in this, but there was just risking that would have been a very bad idea. So this was the only choice really that we had.
You went back to the lake to get a medical kit, and you also had Doc's book on wilderness medicine.
Yeah, there's a great line in Doc's book, and where he talks about, and I'm going to butcher this name, a famous explorer, Peter Freuchen, I think is how you pronounce that, tells the story about when he suffered frostbite and made the decision to hike out of his situation despite how bad it was. So he was just refreezing this extremity. And the last line that Doc had written about this little story was, he lost his leg, but it saved his life. And so I thought, I'm not going to let Scott see that story. We're just gonna edit that. We're gonna keep that one kind of keep that one off to the side. I came back. I went back. I got the medical kit, more food, hiked back to the river where Scott was. We were both very thrilled to see each other safe and sound, because keep in mind too, Churchill, which is 120 miles from us, is known as the polar bear capital of the world. And while we're too far inland, I think, for that to be a concern, it's still there. There's always potential. And there's also, lots of black bears and things like that. So, you're always traveling with a firearm just to make sure that you're as protected, I guess, as you can be. I don't know if they had things like bear spray back then. I'm not sure if they did, but we certainly didn't have any. So,
right. Well, but aside from just animals, you guys are separated. You're hiking back to the lake. He's by himself in the tent. If you fall and break a leg or something,
sure,
now you'll never see each other again, and you'll die separately, and
yep.
and nobody knows. And so, yeah, I can imagine being reunited when you come back. That's got to be encouraging.
Yeah, it definitely. It was definitely a weird, kind of a surprising thing to get a sense of our emotions whenever we would kind of connect like that, because you worry about the other person, and not just for their sake, but your own sake, because you both kind of depend on each other. You need that team to kind of pull this off.
And now you spend a fourth night in that tent back by the river. You're going to set out searching for the cabin again, but did you have any thoughts on why haven't we found this thing yet? I mean, you've got maps. You figure, okay, where is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the frustration, and of course your mind, trying to keep your mind in check too, because your mind starts playing tricks on you. Your mind starts telling you maybe what you flew over wasn't what you thought. All of these things, they just creep in. So you've got to fight those kind of mental demons a little bit. Yeah, there's definitely frustration, but there was also excitement, because it's like, okay, we believed that we had landed, or that we had ended up downstream from the cabin. And so our feeling was the following day, I'm going to be able to go out hike upstream a mile or so and we're going to find it and everything's going to be great. So the next morning, I awakened pretty early, had a good breakfast, and once again said goodbye to Scott in the tent, and I set off. And I hiked maybe about a mile upstream, and I noticed on the bank of the river, some really huge spruce trees. Most of the trees that grow up there they're pretty stunted just because of the extremes. And these were massive spruce trees. And I thought, I'm going to do the only thing I can, and that is I'm going to climb one of these and get a bird's eye view and see if I can either spot the cabin or some landmarks that give me an indication of where things are. And this is tricky just because it's spruce trees, first off, are not easy to climb at all. And I've got all this, I'm climbing with all of this kind of winter gear on, and let alone the danger of doing this, So I kind of took these things into account and thought, well, there's not much else I can do because I'm still not finding this cabin. So I start kind of weaving my way up these limbs, and the limbs of a spruce tree, they're just very tangled. They're very scratchy. They're very it's just not pretty. It's not a pleasant climbing experience. But I did manage to get up above the other trees and kind of take a look around and survey things. And I noticed just upstream from where I was, there was a small lake, for lack of a better word. I would say it's more of a pond. And I thought, well, no one's ever mentioned a lake. No one's ever said anything about a lake around the cabin. And I thought, if I can find this on the map, then certainly I'll be able to find, where we are in relation to the cabin. And I clambered out of this tree. And this was, by the way, the first time I answered nature's call, had a number 2 there so that was my first experience with that. And you definitely feel the cold at that point.
Your territory was marked there.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Exactly. I made my way back to the tent, and by now it's dark. I could just see this kind of illuminated bubble there on the side of the riverbank. I climbed in, and of course, Scott's first question was, "Did you find it?" And I said, I didn't find it, but I think I may have a good clue that's going to point the way. And we immediately opened the map, and we looked, and sure enough, there luckily we had a pretty detailed map. I'm surprised this thing was even on it. But sure enough, there it was, this little dot of water. And based on that, it told us that we were actually a mile upstream from where the cabin was. So the enthusiasm that night was very high. We were very excited. We were convinced, not 100% certain, because, maybe that was something else, but we were fairly convinced we were on the right track. Ate a good meal that night, got plenty of sleep.
And this was night number 5.
Night number 5, exactly. And, again, the temperatures are still hovering in that, 30 below range, somewhere in that neighborhood.
And how was Scott doing with his frostbite at this point?
He was actually, again, this is a testament to Scott's attitude. I think other people may have been much more panicked or concerned, and Scott was very level-headed. He just embraced the fact that this happened, and it wasn't like there was any pain because it's frozen essentially, but the mental anguish of having this injury and what it meant for the rest of the trip. I think that's something you have to deal with, and Scott did an amazing job of kind of managing and accepting the fact that, hey, it is what it is, and I'm just going to have to live with it.
So that morning you headed out with a pretty good degree of confidence.
I was very excited to get out. I set off and started hiking downstream. One of the first things I noticed as I kind of rounded this bend, there was another area where there was a really tall a section of really tall trees. And I remember Doc telling stories of building this cabin. He said, yeah, about a half a mile upstream, we cut some of the really big logs for the cabin. They wanted to cut trees away from the cabin site. And I look and I'm like, oh, there's this incredible stand of trees. Like if I was building a cabin, those are the trees that I would go after, like this is a perfect spot. So I'm feeling like, okay, and maybe this was just my brain trying to send the right signals, but either way, it put some spring in my step. I keep hiking downstream and I'm constantly surveying and panning the riverbank to see if I could spot anything unnatural or anything that looks man-made. When I got about a mile away from where our tent was, I noticed this, through the trees, just a straight level line of snow perpendicular to the trees, about 15 feet off the ground. And clearly there's nothing out there in the woods that is straight and level like that. And I'm like, well, this is definitely worth exploring. So I hiked up into the trees. The cabin itself, it maybe sits 40 yards away from the river, maybe a little more. So I hike up into the trees and I see a mound of snow, but on one side I see, just peeking under the eaves, I see this wall of logs. This thing is buried in snow. Like there's several feet of snow just surrounding it. So like it would be so easy to miss, but clearly there it was. And my first reaction was clearly for our safety. Like, okay, we found it. We're going to be okay. And now we can finally get this adventure started. When I walked into the cabin, which I did cautiously because given the terrible circumstances that we'd found ourselves in, I'm like, who knows? Maybe I'll open the door and there'll just be a bear in there or something. So I entered cautiously, and the cabin, just to give the audience kind of an idea, it consists of like 3 sections. So there's the main cabin, which the interior dimensions are pretty small, maybe 12 by 12. And that structure has a loft where we could sleep. Directly on the south end of the cabin is a room that we call the south wing, which is almost like a breezeway where you enter this kind of room where you can remove gear and you could use it for storage. So you enter through the door of the south wing, and then there's another door immediately to your right that goes into the main cabin. I entered the south wing and I'm standing now in the main cabin, and I'm just looking around, and this was where I had my second thought, and that was like, holy cow, this was the thing that I dreamt about. Like this was that thing. This is the exact thing that I dreamt about. And here I am, like I'm standing in the middle of it. Yes, the circumstances are not great, but I somehow managed to manifest this. It was powerful. It was really a bizarre kind of moment. And I just looked through things quickly to make sure everything was good order and everything seemed relatively sound. I did just, again, a real quick once over because by now it's already getting dark and I was eager to tell Scott the good news. As I was heading back, just the excitement of this was almost, I was moving a lot faster than I wasn't quite running, but I was certainly moving pretty fast. So by the time I get to the tent, I'm sucking in all this ice cold air, which is very dangerous. And I could hardly breathe when Scott opened the tent door. But finally I managed to say, yeah, I found it. This is going to work finally. And so we were both clearly very excited.
And I wanted to hear from Scott what his reaction was when he learned that David had found the cabin. Once again, here's Scott.
When I realized the cabin had been found, I felt a huge sigh of relief. We had been baffled and confused about where the cabin was for several days, especially since we, had been there before in the summer and we had flown over it earlier in the plane and we knew that we were in the neighborhood. But, when you're in vast, pristine wilderness in the middle of the winter at 50 below, you are, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. And so when Dave found the cabin, obviously a huge sigh of relief. But also, interestingly, we were by that time so comfortable in our winter camping situation that we weren't in any rush at that point to just get back to the cabin. We stayed another night and decided to move in a very thoughtful, sort of calm way the next day, because we were at that point, pretty settled into our campsite there at 40 below. So it was a huge sigh of relief and excitement, but also we were extremely grateful, of course.
But at this point, again, it's too late for us to pack everything up and head back to the cabin. So we just decided to spend another night there in the tent. One interesting thing was initially, when we first set up that tent, I forgot to mention this, just an interesting, again, another resourcefulness note. We didn't have any silverware, so we're making this freeze-dried food, and we've got nothing really to eat it with. And Scott had almost like a pocket type of a flashlight, almost like a tchotchke kind of thing that you get from a company, that has its logo and stuff on it. So we took the battery cover off of this flashlight, and that's what we kind of had to use as our spoon, because it's all we could do. The food was too hot to scoop up with your hands, so we just used that and made the best of it.
All of this happened, and you weren't even there quite a week yet.
Mm-hmm.
How long were you at the cabin overall?
Well, the trip that we planned for was a year-long stay. So we finally get moved into the cabin. An interesting note, Scott, for about the first 10 days, stayed indoors. I think, for good reason. He was concerned about his foot. He was concerned about doing further damage to it. But once we reach the cabin, you almost have your lifeline there. It's a safe place. So so long as you weren't doing anything ridiculous, there really was no risk of him refreezing that. And there was no way that he was going to just spend, the rest of his time trapped in the cabin. So he finally started venturing out.
That was smart, really, on his part.
Yeah, it was. So we stayed at the cabin for that first 4 months. And during that time, really took advantage of everything winter has to offer up there. And just in terms of kind of exploring the area and really enjoying the power of winter in the subarctic. And in April, Dr. Forgy flew in to resupply us. He, of course, when he heard the story of that first week, you could just see his eyes getting just wider the more we talked about it, because he's an expert, for example, on hypothermia and cold weather injuries. He is doing all the calculations in his head, no food, no water, extreme exhaustion, et cetera. And so you could just see him kind of like the almost fear, kind of like, holy cow, I'm so glad you guys lived through this. But he said he knew immediately, when he looked at Scott's foot, he's like, I knew immediately that I had to take you out because, he said, you guys did an incredible job taking care of this. It was so good, in fact, that when Scott flew home, he had to get a skin graft on this to get it repaired. Luckily, all of the color had returned to his foot except for that big toe. That big toe was just too damaged. And the surgeon told him, he said, you did such a good job taking care of this that we don't have to really do much prep. We can just get it taken care of right now. So unfortunately, we had to fly out for 2 months. We missed the thaw, which we were both really sad that we didn't get to see that, because it's a very powerful time of the year. But we came back in June, and then spent the next 6 months there from from June to January. Again, the goal was a year. We had to take that 2 months out of it, though, just to get Scott's toe repaired. And there were concerns coming back in, too, because, like, yes, he had his toe repaired. He got a skin graft on it. But now it's you still have to really be careful. You know, if you bang that or you stub it or do something, you know, that all that work could be lost. So he had to really protect that toe and be cautious with it for the remainder of our trip.
Lots more things happened during that time. And you wrote a book about this shortly after you guys got back, and it's called Paradise Creek, A True Story of Adventure and Survival. And it's available on Amazon. I read it. I mean, it's a quick read.
Yeah.
But man, I could not put it down. Especially when you're talking about your first week in particular. But after that, I mean, all the stuff you guys actually built a whole second cabin.
Yeah.
Why did you do that?
The primary reason was we've got plenty of time. Why not? Like, this sounds like a great project. Like, the importance of staying active, of like having things to do, is your best protection against boredom. And once boredom creeps in, that's where all the monsters are, right? In your brain. That's where all the, you start believing that, oh my God, everyone back home is, progressing with their lives and moving on to great things. And I'm just here in the woods doing nothing. And, so you have to fight that. So building the cabin was a great project. What we didn't realize was this added benefit, whereas, we're living in a 12 by 12 box. Tensions can get a little tight, to say the very least. And luckily, Scott and I were pretty cool in terms of we're pretty easygoing people. But even so, living in those conditions, it can get, so we had now had this second cabin. So if tensions got a little strained, we could just say, you know what, I'm gonna head up to the other cabin and hang out for a week. And you would just do that. And then you would get bored with your own company, be like, oh, I got to talk to somebody, I'm going crazy. And then you'd go back. And it really was a huge benefit to have that extra, have a summer home, or a summer and a winter home, I guess, if you will, and use them that way. And that cabin, that second cabin, was built on a feeder stream that was near where I climbed the tree and spotted the lake. So that feeder stream is what we ended up calling Paradise Creek.
In the book, you have so many details of what happened each day. Did you keep a journal while you were there?
I did, but I didn't I was too young, I think, to really understand the value and the importance of keeping an accurate journal. Like, mine was full of fluff and 19-year-old thoughts, like just a lot of, it just really wasn't a solid account. Scott did a much better job keeping an accurate kind of day by day account. In fact, there were a couple times where I reached out to him to say, hey, did this happen on this day? Or was that, like when I was writing the book? And, I really wish I would have done a much better job of keeping an accurate documentation, a journal about that. Yeah, definitely.
Right. Yeah. Because I'm sure at this point, there are things probably that happened that you've forgotten. And if you had a detailed journal, you'd know about those.
The funny thing about that place is the things that you remember are all of the great things, all of the beautiful things, the beautiful experiences. So you kind of get amnesia when it comes to like the bad things about it. And when you come home, you're like, oh, I want to go back to this place. And then you go up there, you're like, oh, I forgot how difficult and miserable this can be,
all
with
these bugs.
Yeah, the bugs or the cold or the, whatever the case. And you just forget that. Yeah. So it's a weird kind of thing that I think it's just a very human thing. You just remember all those great moments.
I know you and Scott still keep in touch. How big a factor is it that you have this as a shared experience?
It's critical. initially my vision, my goal was to do this alone. That was kind of when I was dreaming about this, that's what I saw in my head. There were a couple times where I would go off, or Scott would go off and go camping somewhere by himself. And as I just mentioned, like, it's only a matter of a few days where like you really get bored with your own company. And the ability to return from such a profound, life-changing experience, the ability to call someone and say, hey, remember this or remember that. It would be so sad if you couldn't do that. It would be tragic, I think, if you didn't have that shared experience. It made it so much better.
Yeah, because no one else is going to really understand what it was like just by your description.
Exactly.
You guys were there.
Yeah, definitely.
Have you been back to the cabin?
I have. I think I've made maybe 5 trips back. 2 of those have been with Scott. The last trip back was in 2014. And we're both you're not 19 years old anymore. And so you really realize how hard it is. You know, when you're 19 and you're in the peak physical shape of your life, like, you know, you could do some of those things, and going up there 45 or, you know, whatever, it was a lot. It was a lot of work. Yeah, definitely.
And the cabin's not there anymore.
No, that was another difficult aspect of this, was that we were up there in 2014. One of the added challenges was the fact that we had known that both of the cabins were lost to a forest fire in 2007. So this was kind of our final hurrah up there, and we flew 120 miles upstream, and the goal was to canoe down to where the cabins were located. And so not only was it physically challenging, you have the added emotional challenges of seeing, you know, this cabin that you so dearly love just ash. I mean, so much so, for example, like the Paradise Creek cabin that we built, we hung a set of moose antlers over the door. Those moose antlers, when I found that location of where the front door was, you could see this white outline of those moose antlers where they must have just turned to ash in air and fallen. You could see like the shape of moose antlers, but it was ash that had just dropped to the ground. It was really strange. Yeah, a very difficult and tragic thing to see, but I'm glad we did it.
As an aside, just as my own curiosity, have you watched the TV show Alone? If you have seen that, do you see like some of the obvious mistakes that some of these people make when they're on that, like a reality show?
First, I love that show just for obvious reasons. And I try not to be too judgmental about what I'm seeing, only because I understand, you know, like the one thing that I really love to watch is the people that have a very kind of, you know, the bravado and the macho attitude of like, I'm never going to punch out and, you know, I'm definitely going to win this thing, or I'm in it for the money. Those people usually punch out immediately. They're gone pretty quick. I try not to get overly judgmental, because I understand, like, it's so easy to criticize when you're sitting on your couch.
Of course. Yeah.
And, you know, people like to say like, oh, I know exactly what I would do if I was attacked by a bear. It's like, no, you really don't. Like, until you're standing there looking one of those creatures in the eyes, like you may know what to do, but you don't really know how you're going to react. So I try not to get too critical, because I understand, like, it's when you're in the middle of it, things are just different.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's such a different experience, you know? I mean, I can picture people that are contestants on that show, if they could look at your experience and say, well, of course they could last forever. They had 1,500 pounds worth of gear,
sure,
you know? And I had to choose a list of 10 things that I could bring with me. Right. That's all I get. But on the other hand, you could look at them and say, yeah, but you know, when you get tired and want to quit, it's one radio call and you're coming and you're rescued.
Right.
So yeah, it's just a very different thing.
Well, here too, I mean, again, is the added benefit of having another person with you, just because, like, had I gone up there on my own, I don't think I would have been able to stay a full year by my own. There are certainly a lot of people that can do that sort of thing. And it's not like I'm a social butterfly. It would have been hollow. I think it just wouldn't have had as much meaning, certainly.
What's your incentive for getting this story out there?
I have always tried to think of ways to share the story. When I first came home, I started doing a lot of slide presentations, if that lets you know how long ago this was, to various schools and different organizations. And I always enjoyed hearing from people that said, God, I wish I could do something like that, or I had a chance to do something like that and I didn't do it. And I love hearing what people think about this. It's because there's a lot to think about. It forces, I think, people to think like, God, I wonder if I could do something like that. And it doesn't matter if you're an outdoors person or not. It's the type of story, I think, that just maybe makes you reflect on that and wonder if that's something that you could do. And I enjoy sharing it if it inspires people in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, I always think of that book, My Side of the Mountain, and what a huge impact that had on me. I mean, it spoke to me. And if this story can inspire anyone to maybe not necessarily live in a log cabin, but do something maybe off the beaten path a little bit, then I'm happy with that.
Well, it's incredible. We'll have links to your book and lots of pictures that you sent me of your adventure so people can go and check that out. And you probably are, I would imagine it's very likely that you've inspired some people, maybe not to go spend a year in 40-degree below zero weather, but just to, go camping for the weekend or something.
Yeah.
Get away from electronics and all of that. Yeah.
Right. I hope so.
I don't know. There's something kind of attractive about this idea of being away from everything for a year, maybe even a little magical about it. But those cold temps, that makes me really hesitate. It just hurts to be that cold. I love hearing about it, though. You can see pictures of David and Scott's adventure in the episode notes at whatwasthatlike.com/225. And if there's a question that you would have asked David that I didn't think of, you can ask him directly because he's in the Facebook group, like lots of our previous guests. We have more than 9,000 people in the group right now, and new people are coming in every single day. We have lots of great discussions in there, and we'd love to have you join us. whatwasthatlike.com/Facebook. And guess what? Later this month, I'll be in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we're having another podcast listener meetup. So it'll be you and me and some other What Was That Like listeners just hanging out, maybe having a drink, just getting to know each other. I would seriously love to meet you. All the details are in the Facebook group, but if you're not on Facebook, just email me and I'll fill you in. Scott@whatwasthatlike.com.
Hi, Scott. My name is Cosette. I cannot remember how I stumbled across your podcast, but man, am I glad I did. I am hooked. I am binge listening, but not in order. I'm just going around and listening to whatever I pick out for the hour. And today is Sunday, on Friday, I listened to episode 216, Rachel rescues her children, where Rachel's car overheated and eventually caught on fire. And you know how the story goes. But as I was listening to the story, I was like, man, it's been years since I've seen a car actually overheat and catch on fire. I just don't know if I didn't know that still happened. Well, yesterday, Saturday, I'm going to the store, and in a four-way traffic stop, a young lady's car was overheating. There was the smoke billowing out of the engine. The hood was down. She had gotten out the car. People were just flying by her. I did a U-turn because of your podcast. Luckily, she did not have any kids in the car. She was a young girl. By the time I got to her, she was already on the phone to 911. Then she was calling her dad. And I stayed with her until the fire department showed up, which only took about 5 minutes. She was good and calm and level-headed. And I just told her, I'll stay with you until the fire department comes. Fire department came. I said, okay, young lady, I am leaving now. She said, thank you for stopping. And I went on about running my errand to the store. Stayed in the store about 20 minutes. And on the way back, the car was gone. She was gone. Fire department was gone. So apparently they got everything taken care of. But it was just so funny and ironic that on Friday I listened to that episode, and then Saturday I see someone's car overheat. But had I not listened to that episode, I may not have even stopped. So thank you. I am loving this podcast.
And if you liked this episode, you might also like the episode where I talked with Wonia, who was one of the contestants on Season 6 of Alone. That was episode 75, titled, Wonia Was Alone in the Arctic. Graphics for this episode were created by Bob Bretz. Full episode transcription was created by James Lai. And now, it's time for the listener story. Every main episode ends with an audio story sent in by a listener. If you'd like to hear your story here on the podcast, record it on your phone, like 5 to 10 minutes, and email it to scott@whatwasthatlike.com. This listener talks about experiencing seizures. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
So here's my story. I was living in Scottsdale, Arizona, and this would have been about 2008. A friend of mine asked me to drive her to the airport pretty early. So I did that. And when I got back to my apartment, I decided, you know what, I could probably get a little more sleep since it was so early in the morning before I had to go to work. I work in sales, and every morning at 9 a.m., the sales team has a morning meeting. And work was really close to where I live. On a good day, it was about a 5-minute drive. On a bad day, it was about 7 minutes. So I always left at about 8:50. I was always on time. I'm always punctual, really, for just about everything. So the next thing I know, I'm being awakened by a call from a friend who was asking me where the hell I was since it was 9 and I wasn't there. So I hopped out of bed. I figured I just overslept, which is very unusual for me. I hopped in the shower. I got ready. I drove over to work as fast as I could. I didn't really stop to evaluate how I was feeling. I was just trying to hustle to get to work. Now, if you missed the morning meeting, you weren't given any sales leads for that day unless there were extra. And I remember being pretty pissed because it was September 30th. It was the last day of the month. I needed to get to a certain bonus level, which now looked like I wasn't going to make. So I was kind of bummed. I went into the employee lounge. I sat down. And at that point, I realized I was feeling a little bit off. I remember one of my friends walking in and asking me, JK, are you all right? That's what they called me, JK. You look like you've seen a ghost. Later on, she told me that I really didn't answer her. I just kind of looked at her in a daze. And at that point, I decided to lie down on the couch and maybe rest a little bit. The next thing I know, I wake up, I'm on a gurney. I'm being wheeled out of the building. My friends told me I had a seizure. The paramedics put me into the ambulance and off I went to the hospital. I have no family history. I have no medical conditions that would necessarily lead to a seizure. And that's when I found out that 80% of people who have seizures will never know the reason why, unless you hit your head or, have a bad accident, something obvious, or otherwise you may never know why. They did an MRI, they did an EEG, which is where, they attach all those wires to your head, and they didn't find anything, and they released me a few hours later with an appointment to see a neurologist. In Arizona, they suspend your license for 3 months when you have a seizure, so I ended up heavily relying on my friends. Of course, there weren't Ubers back then. I got home. It was really weird because I found my apartment pretty messed up. There was a huge dent in the door to my bedroom. and I found blood on the corner of my bed and on the shower curtain. And I'm like, what the hell happened here? It looked like a small crime scene. I ended up having about a total of 8 seizures over the next 2 years, and most of them happened at work. I would wake up in the arms of my friends on the floor. They all took very good care of me. I was grateful for that. I always told them just hold me steady whenever that happens, but whatever you do, don't call the ambulance because there's nothing they can do anyway, and the ride to the hospital and the ambulance costs about $800, which is something I learned the hard way. It was funny, they all ended up calling me Twitch just for fun, which I appreciated that. It was just, like I said, for fun. And at this point, no one knew why I was having seizures, even the neurologists. Everyone speculated it was largely emotionally driven. I was going through a divorce at the time, and it was pretty brutal. So one of my last seizures happened the week after my license was reinstated. And by this time, I'm on medication, trying to see which ones work. The doctor and I thought we found the right one, as it had been a while since my last seizure. I was driving home from my work in a new car. I almost always drove with the sunroof open, but that day it was raining, so the sunroof was closed. I was first in line waiting on a red light, about to cross a major 6-lane road, and it was about 5 p.m., so it was pretty busy. And again, the next thing I knew, I was waking up in an ambulance, and I remember saying out loud, "No, not again." I was told I was in a car accident. Apparently, while waiting on the red light, I had a seizure and gunned it across the intersection on that red light. My car ricocheted off the back of another car on the other side of the intersection. So thankfully, there was no contact with any car in the intersection itself. It's kind of a miracle. I bounced off that car right into a light pole. The car was totaled, and the light itself at the top of the pole sort of wiggled, I was told, and then dropped down onto the top of my car. So I just thank God that the sunroof was closed. Otherwise, the outcome of this may have been a lot different. So I'm lying in bed at the hospital, and an officer walks in and proceeds to issue me a ticket for failing to control my vehicle. I said, well, no shit, I couldn't control my vehicle. I had a seizure. He wouldn't budge, though. So he actually gave me the ticket. I was determined to get out of the hospital as quickly as possible because my sales team was having a quarterly award party at a local casino. I was getting an award and I couldn't not be there. So I walked out of the hospital 2 hours later, got in a cab, and I went to the party. Everyone was like, "How are you even here?" I said, as usual, there's nothing they can do. Ironically, after about another year, I got a $1,600 bill from the city to repair the light. Talk about insult to injury. So now it's 15 years later. I haven't had a seizure since. We found the right medication after about 2 years. I'm no longer considered an epileptic. Looking back, I can say that I'm so grateful for my friends and even more grateful that I didn't hurt anyone in that accident or any time at all for that matter. I'm sure that's something that would have required years of therapy to get over had that happened. Now, looking back, when people ask me how I survived that accident, I simply reply with one sentence: divine intervention and Mercedes-Benz.